disaster risk reduction is development. You cannot sustain development if you do not have the capacity to assess your risk and then deal with that risk.
Over 100,000 refugees live in the makeshift tents across this area. And in less than 24 hours, enough snow fell to put many of these shelters in jeopardy.
Down in Damascus, the UN talked today about getting humanitarian aid into some areas tomorrow. Well, they talked about it. Aleppo is unlikely to see it happening.
It's not a coincidence that immediately prior to the civil war in Syria, the country experienced its worst drought on record.
Hello and welcome to all of you. Hopefully you can hear me. It sounds like this microphone's on. I'm Margaret Brennan. I'm a foreign affairs correspondent with CBS News. And we've got a great panel for you in the next hour. So I'd like to invite them all up here to the stage to join me. As you just saw in the video here, this is called Resilience Dialogue. And I want all of you, if you reach into your bags or pockets, turn off the ringers on your cell phones, but feel free to tweet during the course of this conversation, hashtag Resilience Dialogue. That's capital R, capital D. And we will have those on social media, filtering some of that, finding some of the questions and running those up here on stage so you can participate firsthand in the question and answer session here during our panel. So just turn the ringer off, but please stay part of the conversation if you would. And I want to dive right into it. Our panelists here, you may have some of their bios, but I will introduce them as well. We're very focused in the next hour on security risk, both from conflict and disaster zones, and there are far too many examples to choose from here. We're really going to cover the globe and talk a little bit about here at home as well. You saw in the video the emphasis on the worst refugee crisis this world has seen since World War II, coming out of the disaster in Syria that's destabilizing not just the Middle East, but now threatening Europe. You've got what the UN calls the hottest year on record, a string of natural disasters coming through that. And I want to sort through some of the lessons learned and some of the ways to mitigate that risk. Next to me here is Nancy Lindberg. You know her from the United States Institute of Peace, formerly of USAID. She's very focused on some of the fragile environments, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in the Middle East or beyond, and has some firsthand experience about responding to those disaster zones. Next to her, Janani Vivekananda. I hit both the ends this time, I hope. She's going to speak to us about her expertise on climate change and security. And she's head of the environment with climate change and security and international alert. Next to her, we have Erwin Redlener. He's the director at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia's Earth Institute. He wears a few hats. He's also an advisor to New York's Mayor Bill de Blasio. And rounding us out, face you know well here at the World Bank, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer here, formerly Indonesia's Minister of Finance. So let me start out broadly here, Nancy, with you. The World Bank says that the number of disasters around the world is increasing, or at least the count seems to be going up in terms of record keeping. What do you see as the greatest points of strain right now?
First of all, I want to applaud the organizers of the Resilience Dialogue and for moving it from a focus where it's began on natural disasters to connecting the dots to conflict, which answers your question in that where I see the strains are the common challenge of fragility, of whether it's a national or a more local problem of fragility, where you do not have the capacities and the tools to manage shocks, whether they're natural disaster shocks or shocks coming from extremism or from conflict. And you have them clustering with the greatest and most damaging impact in areas of fragility. And so when we look at how to get ahead of these rising challenges where you've got climate change increasing the tempo and the severity of natural disaster events, and you also have a blip in increase of extremism around the globe, and you've got a number of unabated civil wars. What's common is they are emanating from areas that are fragile. And so the importance of this forum is understanding where do we need to go with that? What are the specific ways that we work more upstream instead of waiting for the crisis to be full-blown? And the panels already this morning, I think, have begun to lay out some of the specifics, and that's what this extraordinary group of people who are here with us today will have to carry forward from today, the specifics of getting ahead of those shocks.
But what are those shocks that you see as, can you prioritize what concerns you and what you're most focused on these days?
I think you can't prioritize them because they're so interrelated, that in areas that have conflict, you've got ever greater impact of natural disasters, and conversely, often natural disasters in fragile areas will trigger conflict. If you look at places like South Sudan, the film mentioned Syria having had a serious drought that may have triggered urban migration and greater, some of the desire for that resulted in what were first peaceful protests but quickly became violent. South Sudan, Yemen, these are all places where you've got inextricably and intertwined natural disaster impacts of drought, of earthquakes, of leading to resource scarcity, to famine, and very much intertwined with enormous fragility.
And Janani, you did have the Pentagon highlight all those things as a national security risk, specifically drought, climate change. So the ideas are becoming interlinked now. From your perspective, looking at this through the prism of environmental specialist, do you have areas that are of most concern to you? Does the map match what we just heard from Nancy in terms of those specific references to Syria, to South Sudan, and to Yemen?
I think the map is incredibly complex. Yes, when you overlay the correlation or the incidence of climate impacts or countries most vulnerable to climate change in line with the, excuse me, the last IPCC report, if you overlay that with a mapping of fragile states, there's a very strong correlation. But what I think is really important to note is that it's not simply the countries that are most vulnerable to climate shocks, it's not the extremity of the shock that will determine the risk of conflict, but rather the pre-existing socio-economic and political backdrop against which this shock is going to play out that will determine whether it becomes a disaster or not, a humanitarian crisis or not. And that means that in some contexts, even a smaller degree of kind of climate or disaster impact will trigger a much greater implication on peace and stability. If we look at somewhere like Nigeria or Pakistan, maybe not as much of a priority for kind of climate change adaptation or disaster risk response resourcing or programming as other places that receive much more attention, like Bangladesh. The governance backdrop or the highly divisive or divided nature of that particular society will then make it much harder for a community or a state institution to be able to cope with even a lesser degree of climatic or disaster shock.
Dr. Redliner, though, is fragility the common theme here? Because you've also looked at what's happening in the United States in areas where infrastructure, at least nominally, is there. There are emergency resources, but you've had poor, sometimes, reaction to disaster scenarios.
Yeah, there's definitely some serious common ground among disasters or big stressors, whether it's terrorism or a natural disaster or the effects of climate change. There are common threads that run from the least developed to the most developed countries. And I would just point to what happened after Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf of the United States. We had thousands and thousands of people and families displaced to places where they're literally cut off from services. They were isolated, children weren't going to school, they weren't getting health care and so on. Obviously, not as extreme or severe as we see now around the world, but an example. Another example this very day is what's going on in Flint, Michigan with infrastructural issues that are causing widespread problems that need to be dealt with. Infrastructure and institutional resilience in countries is always critical to both the prevention and the response to any kind of large-scale disaster. And I think, you know, one of the things that we, as a pediatrician, I'm always sort of interested in how the children are faring through any of these. And right now, with the 60 million displaced and refugee people worldwide, some people think up to half of them are children. They are all at risk. And to the extent that children are at risk, so is the future of those societies. And I cannot overstate how important it is that we take a lot of care to make sure that we don't lose children, not just to the disaster or crisis itself, but to the absence of nurturing their health, their education, and so on. Because if you project, you know, let's say 1 million children out of Syria who are no longer going to school, are not getting educated, and are being potentially ideologically redirected, what is it that we expect to happen in 10, 15 years from now? And really, ironically, I would say the same for the children in Flint, Michigan, who are lead poisoned and neglected in a variety of ways. It's like we don't look enough at the future through the eyes and the needs of children, which are vital to how we're going to sustain ourselves and be resilient in the future.
Well, in the example you gave there, I mean, the U.S., there is at least supposed to be able to state and federal government that's answerable. In the other example with refugees, it's not quite so clear when you're cross-border. So where do you need to see that response coming from?
Well, here's where the international community, to me, has its most critical responsibility. And in certain ways, we've looked at children as bellwethers, right? So if we're focused on what are we going to do about this massive refugee and displaced persons crisis globally, you know, if it was up to me, I'd put a lot more emphasis on international efforts to make sure that every child in every camp, in every refugee center, and those that are being integrated into the new societies, that there is a specific agenda, a checklist in a sense of, are you getting your health care? Are they getting educated? Are we paying attention to early development issues? Are we paying attention to reunification with family members, et cetera? It's in some ways complex. On the other hand, it's very, very basic. And failure to pay attention to that is a big problem. I think what you're saying, though, Margaret, is very true. There is not the stability of a U.S. government, for example, or a Western European government in these places. It's whatever the opposite of that is what exists for these families. That is why I think the most compelling need for intelligent, focused international intervention now is more critical than it's been certainly throughout my career, to tell you the truth.
Director Andriawati, that sort of tees you up perfectly. What is the World Bank doing with this very long list of challenges?
Well, first, whether you're talking about the natural disaster or conflict, fragility, violence, they really become a threat of the goals that we want to achieve, that is poverty reduction and shared prosperity. And even more, I think, despite the progress that we made on the poverty reduction now, I think more and more the poverty is going to be concentrated in this conflict fragile area. If you combine with the climate change, the natural disasters, that's even more, because then we are talking about the society or a country which have a very weak institution, so they are not even have the ability to prevent, but even when they are facing with a shock, whether this is in the form of pandemic like Ebola, or you're talking about El Nino now in which they are having a threat, or you're talking about the conflict which is man-made, they are all becoming even more severe. So what is the bank? This is the priority for us. We are more and more working on a fragile conflict era. We are talking about the combination of the natural disaster driven by the climate change with the conflict as a nexus. And the focus is really more on our World Development Report back in 2011 when we are talking about the conflict area, the engagement with the countries dealing with a conflict or natural disaster is really focused on upstream. If you can prevent, that's even better. But if it has happened, then the question about designing humanitarian or emergency into development is becoming very critical. I have my own experience in Indonesia. At that time, I was finance minister in new cabinet. We have Aceh tsunami hit Indonesia. For your information, many of you maybe, because now conflict in Syria is really overtaken, but if you talk about Aceh at that time, back in 2004, it was the province in conflict. So the tsunami affecting, or in this case, wiped almost half of the city in this case. It's become a momentum of rebuilding, but also at the same time, not only rebuilding physically, but also building the institutional and peace process. And that until now, which is long lasted. If you look at the same tsunami, which is 2004, hit Aceh, but then you can see the repercussion to many other parts of the world, including Sri Lanka, the same tsunami is actually creating more conflict there after the post-tsunami in the Tamil. So this is exactly why the bank is really investing on our, what we call it, cross-cutting issue, in which our fragile conflict state division is working with our disaster risk management in order for us to be able to actually come with a much more comprehensive, but also it's not going to be like one-off. This kind of development challenge will definitely require a much more longer term, long lasting, even in this case for the bank, to try to motivate our staff to be risk taker. Because if you are measuring your success only building something in a short run, in which you can cut the ribbon to actually celebrate it, then you are not going to get that kind of engagement. And that's why this forum is really very good for us to actually recognize that when you are dealing with the development and conflict in natural disaster, then you really need a lot of partnership. And we really welcome this kind of forum in order for us to be able to not only strengthening partnership, but also learning from many other institutions.
But it sounds like the onus is on local institutions and governments to anticipate these risks.
Well, yeah, you are mentioning about this, then my memories then rewind me with so many things, whether this is in Aceh or we are talking about Timor-Leste, you're talking about Myanmar, you're talking Ebola. When the country is small, in which you're talking about local government, central government is just too close and too small, and then they are going to wipe, whether by conflict or by natural disaster, definitely international community is going to be very critical. In a country like Indonesia, which is big, when you hit by tsunami in Aceh, the whole local government paralyzed, because you are even talking about civil servant, 60% died during this tsunami. So definitely national government can come, even military, on a non-military operation, on a humanitarian operation, by deploying the military is going to be very critical in actually substituting of what you call it, totally destroy institutional and physical. And then you are going to deal with designing the recovery. Post-conflict or post-disaster damage assessment is going to be very critical, because it will create at least the first idea about what is the magnitude of damage and how we are going to rebuild. Here, the World Bank is really investing quite a lot. Our disaster risk management here is actually quite sophisticated, and that's why we can deploy, for example, like in Haiyan tsunami in Philippines, we actually can deploy very quickly. So I think it's really depend on the situation. While we can recognize the general pattern, you really have to look at the very tailor-made, not one size fits all. National, local government capacity building need to be rebuilt after conflict or after disaster. National government is going to be very critical, and international cooperation. Last point on the international cooperation in this case in helping. That's really coming from my own experience. Sometimes the good intention and the excitement of the international community to help can overwhelm the local government. You need to coordinate. They come with so many. I mean, in a tsunami, they come with a different package. They are asking for overwhelming for the port authority to clear so many. So that also may be the lesson learned about how the international community can coordinate so that it will not overwhelm the country or the place which is actually suffering from the disaster, but rather really helping and doing the catalytic role in rebuilding again.
Nancy, I think you want to jump in.
Well, I wanted to build on your question about the prevention issue, because one of the aspects that I think is important and powerful about the whole resilience dialogue is understanding and this idea of risk, that we know, especially at a time of greater climate change impacts, that there will be increased natural disasters. I mean, all the data is telling us that. We also know that conflict is a fact of human nature, that there will be conflicts in societies and in countries. The question is, how do you manage conflict such that it doesn't become violent, and how do you prepare for disaster to minimize the impact? So it's the difference of Haiti versus the San Francisco earthquake that I lived through. So the core piece of this is really what we get at when we talk about Goal 16, which we started the morning discussing. And that is when you have effective, accountable, inclusive governments at every level, you have the ability to prepare more effectively, to respond more effectively to natural disaster, and to manage conflict more effectively. The second important piece is understanding how important it is to work at the local level, and that equipping communities and various levels of institutions with the tools either to manage conflict, dialogue, peace building, negotiation, or to prepare for disaster. So the tools differ a little bit in terms of what is the risk that you're most concerned about. But we're seeing that you can't prevent the risks from happening, but you can do a better job of having the fundamentals by adhering to Goal 16. I would add to that, however, that we need to collectively better understand what are the factors that create resilience to shocks like the threat of violent extremism. And one of the things that USIP is doing is a lot of research at the community level, because it becomes a very micro dynamic, that these issues happen at a very local, specific level. But what are the factors that enable this community to withstand violent extremism, that help this faith community not succumb to the political pressures to become a voice of hate and divisiveness in their community? And we see that there are places where communities or individuals are extraordinarily resilient, that they withstand all of these shocks, and that they withstand the threat of extremism or hate speech or political division. And so doing the kind of research that helps us more understand that, to understand those conflict patterns, will be critical for us to be able to do a better job of the upstream work to support that and enable that to happen on a broader scale.
Are there predictive things that you're mapping? Did you want to jump in?
Irwin, you want?
Well, I
thought you were signaling.
Well, I was going to
in.
jump in about prevention, though, but I'm agreeing with what Nancy was saying. But do you want me to hold that?
Sure. Complete your thought.
Okay. Here's my thought. Well, first of all, resilience. I just want to acknowledge the fact that this is it's a very amorphous term. We don't exactly know how to define it. So having a goal to be more resilient leaves us in this sort of a quandary of not knowing exactly what is the end point, what are the highlights along the way to get to be resilient. But that notwithstanding, I want to say a word about prevention. which is really absolutely critical, and it has to do with resilience, but it's also the most difficult part of getting countries, societies, and people ready, because really prevention, in terms of preventing or mitigating the consequences of large-scale disaster, has to do with everything from individual resilience and mental preparedness, and the resilience of institutions in communities and in countries, the resilience of governments. And at the end of the day, we are left with this challenge of where's the motivation? Resilience, unfortunately, and prevention both suffer, unfortunately, from the lack of a spotlight. So your network and other networks are not covering prevention like you cover disasters. That's just the way it is, and we all understand that.
Cover things that happen.
What's that?
They cover things that happen.
You cover things that happen.
Not that might.
But what I'm saying is the things that happen, like Katrina, like the tsunami, like Fukushima, are high drama, like Super Tuesday. So you're there when it's happening. Where you're not there is during the end stages of recovery, which is very difficult on the far end, and in prevention on the near end. And this is really a problem, because just take the United States. So the American Society of Civil Engineers has estimated it would be $3.7 trillion to fix U.S. infrastructure. That's in the United States, which is an enormous price tag, but something that's critically needed to be done. If we wanted our country to be more resilient in the U.S., we'd make that investment over time. But try proposing that in our current political state, it's not going to happen. And then as you look at other countries around the world, it is really difficult to get the resources without the spotlight. So this is a problem that we're facing. Ideally, we would be highly focused on prevention, but right now, I don't quite see how that's going to unfold in a timely way.
Well, I think it's supposed to be both in this case, Margaret. I just want to jump in because this is really critical. When you talk about the prevention, I mean, when you talk resilience and prevention, at the individual level, people know now, at least with the technology information, I think the access of information is much better. Coverage of many of the disasters is actually quite amazing, that people are more educated. But that's not translated into change of the lifestyle, or in this case, for example, of a country, like many countries which is prone for earthquake, like Japan, or even in my own country, Indonesia. The building code is definitely become one of part of the prevention. If you talk about tsunami, then you have a different kind of prevention, recognizing what is exactly that natural disaster. El Nino is totally different, but at least even 6 months before it's coming is already being said that it is coming, and that kind of what you call it, both prevention and building resilience is going to be very critical. When you talk about post-disaster in this case, I think again technologies definitely can help a lot. The satellite image of damage can definitely very quick in identifying. Then you can design about the estimated loss, then you are going to rebuild. But again, I think the last point, because when you're talking about the peace and related conflict, when you rebuild an area which is not only because of natural disaster, but combined with the conflict, that both the process, the design, and the result is going to be very critical, very equally important. Give you the example. Like in Aceh, when you have to rebuild the house, you really have to identify, and that is understanding what is the cultural, even religious preference, how the community work together. That is going to be very critical. It's easier and maybe faster for government just rebuild the house. That is going to be much politically, usually it's going to be maybe good, because then you can show to the public that I rebuilt. But if you don't really understand the dynamic of the people, you can exacerbate this kind of conflict. So again, in this case, sometimes the process which is inclusive taken a little bit longer, but it could really become a trigger for the peace building.
Janani, I want you to jump in. I mean, your issue has been getting more spotlight, but does it actually translate into, what we're talking about, preventing and anticipating?
Yeah, no, I think the point that Owen made about trying to make the case for prevention is incredibly challenging from the peace-building world, where my organization sits. It's very challenging when there are these competing development, humanitarian, and conflict demands to try and get resourcing for something that, if you're successful in doing it, you have nothing to show for it. So you've got your development minister saying, how can we show our taxpayers, how can we show our, the Treasury that we're trying to get this resourcing from, that this is an effective use of money? Well, it is, but we can't show, well, if we've done our job well, we can't show that that there has been an impact because there's an absence of conflict. And that's a really important issue for disasters, for addressing the linkages between disasters, climate change, and conflict. Because if we're trying to shift resourcing upstream, I mean, yes, there's some really excellent work being done around disaster management and preparedness, but if we look at where the bulk of the money's going, it's going on response, because that's where you can generate the most funding from big campaigns, post-tsunami relief, etc. But if we wanted to be much more savvy about it, and actually much more cost-effective, we would shift that upstream, and that would mean also shifting how we see building resilience, because at the moment what we're seeing is the need to make it quite a technical area of engagement. We need to show, particularly because of the way the climate change aid architecture has been designed, that climate change money has to be spent in a way that's separate and discrete from development funding. We need to show that our work on climate change or disasters is specifically addressing a physical hazard. But as Nancy and the rest of the panel have mentioned, these challenges, these hazards, these risks are interlinked. Mm-hmm. That it's not simply looking at vulnerability to a flood, it's looking at the livelihood insecurity, the weak infrastructure, the poor governance institutions that make a community or society unable to cope with these risks. But if we wanted to build resilience to that, are we then to build a flood wall, or are we going to pay the civil servants' salaries so that they can do their jobs, or are we going to invest in governance or invest in building the social contract or social cohesion? These things don't look like climate change adaptation measures or building resilience in the way that the Sendai framework, in fact, might stipulate. But they are incredibly important, but we're almost prevented from doing that institutionally because of the way that the international frameworks have created these silos. And I mean, on that, 2015 was the landmark year for shifting the paradigms around development, how we do disaster response and preparedness and climate change. And yet, if we look at some of the frameworks, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction doesn't mention conflict at all.
Well, I think what you're getting at is drilling down to actually being specific and concrete, which is not something that, when speaking in theories and hypotheticals is easy to do. But I'm going to actually ask you to do that because you're going there already. And that's one of the comments, I should say, from one of our followers online. His name is David. He said, Dr. Redliner is right. We don't have a definition of resilience. Can we get a short definition from each panelist? So I want you actually to complete sort of what you were talking about. You gave us some concrete examples, but what actually does resilience mean in your world and from your view?
I could give you a bunch of resilience definitions. In fact, I feel like I spent about 3 or 4 years of my life sitting in meetings where we discussed the definition of resilience before we agreed on one. But what I'd prefer to do
in concrete terms.
In concrete terms, I would say, and this might, well, I hope it will answer the question, resilience, definitions, they're all about building back better, building communities that can cope with a range of possible shocks. But I think actually what resilience looks like, it looks different in every context, and that's the key. It entirely depends on the context. And in Plateau State, in Nigeria, it could look like paying civil servant salaries. In Sindh, in Pakistan, it could look like equitable allocation of natural resource, public goods, and
sounds
water
like basic
and land
governance is
tenure.
what you're talking about.
I think governance it really sits at the heart of resilience. Yes, we need to address physical hazards, but what makes a hazard a disaster shock or a crisis is a lack of governance capacity, and that there central to that is the social contract, because as Nancy mentioned, the San Francisco earthquake did not lead to conflict because there was an governance environment and a community, a socially coherent community that could deal with that shock. Mm-hmm. So I think governance is central, and from our research across numerous regions across the world, we're also finding that social cohesion, not just cohesion within groups, but across different groups, is also key to resilience. And we're really finding that's a prevalent trend in our research in South Asia and in Africa and Central Asia.
Nancy, do you have a concrete example of resilience?
Yeah, I mean, I take the question to heart, because I do think that we've all struggled with, is resilience becoming such a baggy term that it's the theory of everything? However, I strongly believe that it is a critical concept that is reshaping how we understand a shared goal through our humanitarian and development efforts. And it is the outcome of the kind of work that transcends the stovepipes that number of us have talked about this morning already, and enables us to move towards a shared goal of helping individuals, societies, states, regions, systems be able to respond to shocks. And then there's various ways of taking that continue on a pathway to development. None of that can happen if you don't have the fundamentals of a state-society contract and accountable, inclusive, effective institutions at every level. So it brings us back. Which you don't have in conflict zones. Which you don't have in conflict zones, and you don't have in weak states. It can be either. But when you have the absence of what is contained in Goal 16, which is, as I said earlier this morning, it's this terribly wonky construct that we need to find a better way of talking about. And I don't think resilience is the totality of what you get with Goal 16, but it is one of the outcomes, that you have the ability to manage a better preparedness and response to natural disaster, and you have the ability to manage conflict so it doesn't become violent. The key that was mentioned by one of my former colleagues in the previous panel is that over the last decade, we have shifted from 80% of our humanitarian funding going to natural disaster response to 80% of our humanitarian funding going to conflicts and long protracted crises. This was Tom Stahl who noted this. And what that means is that at a time where we have increased natural disasters that are being mapped and in greater severity and greater tempo, droughts that used to be every 10 years are happening every couple of years now. We have most of our available humanitarian funds tied up in conflicts, violent conflicts, and an ever-growing delta between need and what we're able to raise internationally. So it increases the urgency that we collectively move towards this shared understanding of Goal 16 and have that be the shared focus of both of our humanitarian and our development and our political and our security efforts, because at the heart of it you've got politics. Mm-hmm. And politics is what makes it so very difficult. It's the corruption, it's the poor leadership, and it's the exclusionary practices. And that, by the way, is why housing is always the last thing to be built after a disaster. And you always have these terrible reports of people living in containers or living in quick temporary housing, because it is you get quickly into the difficulty of the politics and the policies of what to rebuild where. And so all of that is better addressed when you've got the fundamentals as expressed by Goal 16, and therefore greater resilience for when these shocks do hit.
A lot of basic governance again there, a lot of also international community and fundraising and functioning better there.
Can I just say,
do you want to jump in here?
I do.
But before you do, governance, I think, is an important shorthand to understand that we mean the state-society contract, and we need that accountability and transparency. Because I think governance is a word that people have used for a very long time that we need to shift the meaning of. It's not just capacity.
What do you mean by contract?
The understanding that the government, a strong institution without having a contract with its citizens, is not necessarily resilient. It could be strong in a brittle way. And we see this in places like Syria, like various parts of the Middle East, where it looks like you've got a strong capacitated state, but it has no legitimacy. It's not inclusive of its citizens, and so, or you've got a lot of corruption. And so what appears to be strong is very brittle. It is not resilient.
Here's a take on resilience that I just want to say. So to me, and kind of we know it when we get there sort of thing, but the fact is that resilience should mean, if you're talking about disasters and crises, it should be the ability to understand and prepare for and mitigate what we know is likely to be happening, on the one hand, and the second part of it is the ability to respond robustly and appropriately to those things which we could not have predicted. You didn't know this, Margaret, but my part-time job is fortune teller. And I'm going to tell you something right here, which is that it is almost certain that a major city in the world is going to be destroyed by an earthquake within the next 15 years. It is almost certain that we're going to have at least 2 to 3 major droughts affecting regions of the world that we didn't anticipate, maybe or maybe not related to climate change. It is almost certain that in the next 10 years, we'll have at least 2 nuclear power plants doing a Fukushima for us somewhere in the world. And it is almost certain, I would say certain, but maybe you don't, but that the loose nuclear and radioactive material that is all over the world is going to be stolen, acquired in some way by a terrorist group that's going to detonate at least a dirty bomb, if not something worse than that, someplace in the world. So I'm telling you right now that these things are happening. But come back to the first thing I said, which is the earthquake. We know for a fact that even with the history on the west coast of the United States of many earthquakes, or at least enough earthquakes to get our attention on the west coast, that only a small fraction of the hospitals, schools, homes, office buildings have been retrofitted properly to be able to withstand an earthquake. And we know it's coming. It's basically inevitable. What we've had now, our experience for the last 50 years, are what I would call random acts of preparedness that do not amount to a cohesive, grown-up way of dealing with making our society safer and more resilient. This disturbs me. It comes back to governance, and we say good governance, and maybe you can define that because I'm not sure what we mean.
You're talking about politics, too.
Yeah, grown-up politics and grown-up governance would be a wonderful thing. But right now, we know things are coming. They're in slow-mo, and we're in even more slow-mo, and we don't even fix the things that we know can be fixed. No less be prepared for the things that we cannot necessarily predict and we can't do anything about, including things like cybersecurity and cyber threats, other kinds of bio threats. We know for a fact that superbugs, completely resistant to every antibiotic, are popping up all over the world for a variety of reasons. We can't even get control of that. We don't even have control over how to rapidly prepare vaccines for the next Ebola or whatever it is, the Zika virus or whatever we might have. We got problems all over the place. And a lot of it has to do with the lack, including in the United States, maybe especially, I'll let you know tonight after the election returns come in, but maybe especially in the United States, we don't have the thoughtful, wise capacity to make decisions in a complex society. And that really worries me a great deal.
Srimaliani, I want to let you come in with your definition here, but this scenario, this Mad Max-like scenario that I think a long list of many challenges is not something we're glossing over. We can come back to. But for you, in concrete terms, what is resilience?
Well, it is at the individual, institutional, and the infrastructure. On an institutional, including decision-making process, the politics, and how the decision can be made and executed. So basically, at the individual level is, of course, the knowledge. Not all shocks known, and that's why something which can be predicted, something which is totally surprise, or in this is coming external. What is make a society or a country different when at the individual level, they know how to react. They rely on an institution as well as public information that can guide them to respond to this kind of shock. And that linked to so many, what we call it, the social trust or distrust in this case. Are you trusting your leader? Are you trusting your government? Are you trusting your whoever? But that is going, when you are in a situation of chaos or shock, then what is actually built within that society, who am I going to listen? What kind of information should I get from where? And whether I trust that. It's going to matter a lot. And that's what you call it institutional and what you call it governance, accountability, the ability that they can build trust between the society and the institution. And because, you know, at this moment, especially with the openness and all those things, shock can happen and people can be easily disoriented, and there is no mechanism that can become creating what you call it resilience, because people then reacting individually, and then the sum of all this individual reaction is going to be even more disaster when you are not really organized. You can talk, you talk about all the example. First, if you talk about the earthquake, which you make this prediction that is going to happen in any place in the world, any country on the ring of fire, then the movement of the plate in the earth is definitely will create an earthquake. Indonesia is a frequently hard hit. Even if you are going to ask all the scientists, they know that earthquake can happen, but they cannot predict when exactly is going to happen where. And that's exactly the question about resilience, how you are going to build the society. If you have a high-rise building, the building code. If you are going to be in a school, what kind of building code and institutional responses when the earthquake happen. If your natural disaster is actually in the form of like tsunami or what you call it, hurricane, then you have a totally different pattern of what you call it, education of the individual level and institutional mechanism to do it. That's happened in Philippines in this case, and many countries in the Pacific, which is very vulnerable, and Caribbean. The Caribbean island can suffer easily from all this hurricane, and sometimes it's the whole or 1/3 or 1/2 of their GDP can be wiped only in one night of the hurricane. Then you are going to ask about how you have to build that kind of economy and society so that they can withstand. If the shock in the form of pandemic like Ebola, we learn a lot from this Ebola, that those countries, because they don't have health system, that become totally uncontrollable. The victim as well as the cost to the society and economy again is much larger when you don't have, again, the institution that is health system in which people can rely when the outbreak happen. So that kind of thing, again and again, it seems like it really come to the what you call it resilience is actually in the form of institution. Usually it is a public institution in which people, public, have the trust of those institutions. And that really need to be built on a record. I mean, whether who run those institutions is actually clean, accountable, transparent. Are they actually effective when the test is coming, when there is a shock that they can really respond it? That kind of what you call building institution is always a long-term and challenging. And this is the core of many development issues that we are dealing with many of our clients here.
Can you speak quickly to the scenario that's the exact opposite of the societies you just sketched out, where there are actual institutions, and the war zone in Syria? I know the World Bank has actually been looking and crunching numbers to assess damage. This is well before the conflict itself has ended, but you're looking ahead. Mm-hmm. What are the numbers and what is the kind of predictive work you're doing there?
I have the number here, so I'm not really, I don't know whether I'm comfortable to cite it, all this number about the estimation of the damage by city in this case because of the Syrian war. But I think the most important in this case is even the Syrian war is creating a flood of refugees from the neighboring country. I mean, we have an operation, for example, in Iraq, in which we know that the local government, the dynamic of the war is going to create even more exacerbated of how this flow of refugee. You're talking about Turkey, or we're talking now about Lebanon as well as Jordan. We are now talking about the estimated need for those countries surrounding Syria in order for them to actually manage and to provide even basic services for many of these refugees. In Jordan, it can cost up to 3 billion per year. In Lebanon, can be 1.8 billion. And you're not talking about just, okay, put it in a camp. The magnitude of the refugee is so big that you actually need to rebuild the country and really design the development. And that's why the question not only about putting the temporary shelter, but you're talking about the education system, build the school, you're talking about the health services, you're talking about job creation. Because the refugee can stay, in this case in many countries, as long as 17 years in a host country. So you're not talking about a temporary 1 month, 2 months. You really need to integrate that one. And that's why the discussion that we are having here in the World Bank is really not, we cannot operate in Syria at this moment because of the security and so on. But we are operating in all surrounding neighboring countries that we really try to work. Jim mentioned this morning about MENA initiative. Basically is building the basic services, rebuilding the social trust through this public institution, local government effectiveness, and also creating jobs. Because if it is not, the refugee can become unemployed and then become a social problem.
Nancy, I think you wanted to, I want both of you to jump in on this, but I want to highlight that we've gotten 2 questions now on exactly this concept of fractured societies, specifically Syria, and how do you possibly respond? So if you could touch on those 2, and you next.
Well, 2 examples. I wanted to just, your example about Ebola was not just the problem of health systems that were ineffective, but also both Sierra Leone and Liberia were coming out of long, bloody civil wars. There was no trust in the government. And so Ebola is a very avoidable disease, but the government was giving these terrific health messages. Nobody believed it, and they ignored it. And so it wasn't until faith leaders and tribal leaders started being the messengers of those important lessons of how to keep safe that they began to have traction. And so in Syria and in Iraq, I would say, where you've got terrible dissolution of trust, where people are, they don't know who to believe or who to trust. Former neighbors have turned against one another. What used to be a multicultural, multi-religious society in both countries has been terribly, terribly fractured. It's unclear whether it will come back together again. But we do know that it is possible to work now with community leaders, with faith leaders, to help them come together across divides to negotiate particular solutions for their communities. USIP, and I know others have done this, have worked with communities where you do have access. We did it with a community in the northeast of Syria to negotiate how a road would be opened so that it benefited. It was a point of some conflict, but the negotiation enabled tribal and religious leaders to come together, come to an agreement, enable families to come home and keep their community from succumbing to conflict. And we will need to invest now in the refugee camps, in the areas where we have access, on specifically and deliberately equipping Syrians, community, faith, tribal leaders with the tools that enable them to sit down, have negotiations, have dialogue now and well into the future, because otherwise investments in infrastructure could just be undone with continuing rounds and cycles of conflict.
Janai, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I guess we've talked a lot about the drivers of conflict in Syria and how climate change and the drought played into that. What's less talked about is the role of climate change and environmental risks in any peace process that we're looking at and post-conflict reconstruction.
You mean access to resources?
Access to resources, water. Water is going to be critical. There's not a lot of water in Syria or the surrounding region, both groundwater and surface water. And yet, within the kind of immediate conflict, post-conflict reconstruction community, climate and environmental issues aren't really seen as a priority. You know, it's let's talk about peace, let's get peace set in first, and then we can come back later, you know, much further downstream and address some of these climate issues. Actually, we understand that water was a key driver of conflict, access to that resource.
Because of migration.
All the knock-on consequences of that. And so we need to understand then what the complexity of these factors, the way that the conflict drivers, environmental stress, the dynamic nature of climate change as it plays out in Syria and the region will affect any kind of peace opportunities. Things like rehabilitating and reintegrating migrants back into livelihoods. The predominant livelihood would have been agriculture, but that's no longer viable. We understand that farming or unviable farming livelihoods drove over 1 million people to move from rural to urban centres. If we then reintegrate people back into farming livelihoods, that's not going to be sustainable and could actually seriously undermine any fragile peace process. Similarly, construction is incredibly water intensive, so we need to rethink how we use the water, the timber, the concrete, the bricks that are required. Even like at this micro level we saw in South Sudan or in the response to Darfur, that the humanitarian response actually undermined the long-term sustainability of those communities because they were unsustainably using resources like wood to construct shelter. So we need to understand, both in response and also in building resilience, the ways in which conflict drivers interact with disasters and climate change. And it's only through understanding these interlinkages, both the direct consequences and the indirect consequences, can we then address them and ensure kind of linked responses that build resilience to not just a single hazard, because no hazard is or no risk is ever experienced in a vacuum, but resilience to cope with the range of risks that households and communities are facing, because that's how they face these risks, as compound, kind of messy realities rather than just the risk of, hazard X.
For our closing thought here, because we're running out of time, Dr. Redlener, I'd like you to come back to that scenario of all the risks that you are seeing out there. And if you can be a little prescriptive, one of our last questions is, how do you encourage resilience at the community level, and whether there's any technology that you see that can be helpful with that? So with the hope of ending on an up note,
first of all,
I hand it to you.
Little diatribe was really on behalf of my 6 grandchildren that I actually really am worried about for the future, but also explains why I'm not invited to social gatherings much anymore. Well, first of all, I'm guilty of this, and others in my sort of sphere are as well, which is that we use terminology like we need to, we must, we have to, and the problem is what are the words, what are the prescriptions coming out of the people that actually have control of the resources and the priority setting, which means national governments and international governments, especially when it comes to dealing with these macro problems. And so my prescriptions would be really better governance as defined by sustainable representative governments that have control of sufficient resources to make these big differences. No matter how much I rail and rant about it, I have no power to change, other than by advocacy, to change how many buildings are retrofitted in the Ring of Fire or in San Francisco, for that matter. So there's a lot that I can talk about, but I think the real answer is, do we have responsible government with sufficient resources to make this happen? And in the absence of that, we really have to understand the role and impact of the international governing agencies.
And when you say resources, do you mean tools specifically? I mean, what are you talking about there? Are you just talking about money?
No, I mean in governments, national governments.
You said resources. You need
access. Yeah, the resources means that, unfortunately, there are countries that really don't need new resources, like the United States and much of Western Europe. And then there's countries that really, really need, no matter how good government is, if there's not enough resources to do what's necessary, that they have to be supported by the international community, because we're all in this together. I think the days in which we could isolate a developing country, a struggling country, from the rest of the world in terms of the economy, the climate, et cetera, those days are long gone. I think we're just right now in the middle of that big realization. So the struggles to get resources where they're actually needed is something that's going to be an ongoing battle that's going to have to be taken up by very powerful agencies, individuals, and so forth. That's a work in progress. There's smaller things that we could do. One other just quick example. A few years ago, there was a string of tornadoes in Oklahoma. Killed one of the incidents there was 6 children were killed in an elementary school in Oklahoma from a tornado that had no tornado shelter. So for those of you not from the U.S., Tornado Alley is where we describe the high prevalence areas for tornadoes. Oklahoma doesn't require schools to have shelters in them, so some do, some don't. Fixable by a law and a minimal amount of resources. That's a developing world, a developed world challenge or crisis. Much more severe, obviously, internationally. Technology, to get to the question though, does have great potential for spreading information, for creating connectivity, for really being able to have national governments and major institutions be able to communicate among each other, to break down those stovepipe barriers, to do all sorts of things to bring people rapidly from 3 centuries ago to 2016. And I think we've seen that with, for example, cellular telephone technology throughout much of the developing world, particularly in Africa, has really leapfrogged the ability of countries and individuals to function. It's really important. There are all sorts of innovative ways that technology will be an answer. Maybe it'll mitigate some of the climate change issues. Maybe we'll be able to figure out how new technologies and innovation in those spheres will allow us to develop vaccines in 6 weeks as opposed to a year and a half. So I see much promise there. But those forces have to be gathered. They can't be these random, this company comes up with that, this government comes up with something else. I would like to see much more cohesion and joint planning for how to maximize the technology that's at our fingers.
All right. Well, there's plenty more to talk about, but we've run out of time. So thank you to all of you. Thanks to the audience. Thanks for all of you watching online and sending in your questions as well. Thanks.
Thank you.